Okay, this afternoon, I want to talk a little bit about the way we claim our fundamental rights or our constitutional rights and what happens when things get in the way, when there are external circumstances, wars, natural disasters, or politics get in the way, or maybe our privilege makes other people want to take it away from them. And I just want to go over a few in this video, just go over a few very a couple of concepts. Um, so first of all, there's a picture of me at Freddy's Beach Bar, but I want to load PDF of and this is Windows 11, and I want to get it from my computer and not from the OneDrive. It's a lot more complicated than documents. So there we are. And this is some terminology. Looks like it's right behind the my picture. Let's just start out by saying that a natural right is a right that would normally be recognized as fundamental in a well-run democracy when things are running smoothly. And note that it's not a natural right to be born to a good family and be born into a democratic country in a favorable time, or to be born at any particular time. Could have been born at the time of Christ or something. I could have seen the ascension or something, but I didn't. I'm living today. It seemed like I've had a very special life in a way. And then I want to just talk about some of the concepts. There is basically rights are established by an operative clause and a justification clause. And a good example is the Second Amendment, where they talk about a well-regulated militia. And the Supreme Court in Heller back in 2008 said we don't need to satisfy a justification clause anymore because that doesn't apply to today's society. And so the operative clause is simply the purpose of the right in a practical sense, particularly in an immediate sense. People have a right to bear arms and even keep them loaded in a house to protect their home and property. So that was the basic idea. And so the justification is more about whether the purported right is fair and is good for societal welfare in the long run. And that gets into sometimes gets into things like privilege and oppression and all these concepts. The operative clause is more about whether there's an immediate problem that would interfere with establishing the right. I think the most important right that most of us experience is the right to personal agency, to be and express who we are, or who I am private. First around your own people, more or less privately in a family, and then much more recently, publicly with the internet, as things started changing around the year, even a little before the year 2000, and people could be found online. I just want to run through a few concepts and then in another video, we talk about them in more detail, that affect your right, your being able to be yourself. One is your performativity, your temperament, your set of inclinations and behaviors that you like that have an effect on your ability to be part of a group, act as a member of a group. Because because typically people are born into a situation their family expects them to be part of the family and work, and eventually when they get older, form a family and have children themselves and carry the family on. But in more recent times, that's been less common. And people have gone their own way, as I have, men going their own way and so forth. And particularly with gay rights and starting, in the 60s, and then more recently it's become more complicated with gender theory and so forth. But the other thing, but anyway, your performativity is kind of what you're inclined to do and to like to do, and that affects how well you fit into the group. Normativity is a set of behaviors that are so common that relatively few people don't exhibit them. In our society, it used to be most people married and had children and could function in an intimate relationship with one person for their lives and live that way. I didn't really grow up to live that way, but I still was able to assimilate as society got freer as a gay man. I was able to assimilate and function in the workplace and function online and function and travel and do my own thing with music and chess and all these sorts of things. I was able to assimilate, but not everyone is that able to assimilate. I have to go to the next page. And so there's a lot of this has to do with your relationship with being in either your family or your tribe, or if you join something. So we have a process where people prioritize their participation in groups over their own interests. That's enlistment and allyship. We have the idea of identity, which doesn't have to be related to gender. The polarities of Paul Rosenfeld I've talked about in the past. That was really for personal growth only. The performativities that Judith Butler talks about are really very similar to polarities when they're in relation to gender. And even the way a person uses property has a lot to do with how the person identifies themselves in public and with others. That was very true of my father, particularly in the 50s. He set himself in a way that was appropriate for the time and had a very rich life. But you couldn't have quite the same life today. And we talk about what a marginalized group is. And of course, when you have a group that is considered marginalized, can be wrong to speak about them. It can be problematic to talk about them gratuitously because you might be attracting violence toward them. That's at least the fear, and that's a lot of what some of the rules online have been. Particularly, it's eased up a little bit, but particularly in the past few years during the Trump administration and after Charlottesville and January 6th and everything. The idea that sometimes people are expected to sacrifice, and that has a lot to do with military conscription too. One of the fundamental rights is freedom. Is freedom from servitude, and you could think of conscription as a kind of servitude, and but that is. Sometimes the external circumstances are so great, or you may be living in a country that has been set up in a way which is contestable. And I don't want to get into Israel right now, but that's obviously an example. So a lot of times being prepared to participate by possibly having a very major loss yourself and sort of stepping up to that when it's your turn becomes a moral issue. You have an issue of cowardice and that kind of thing. And that was a very important issue that I talked about in my book, particularly in chapter 2, when I talked about the draft back in the Vietnam era and student deferments and that kind of thing. Now, then I talk about internet speech, there's freedom of speech, but that doesn't guarantee freedom of reach, which is a term that Brian Stelter of CNN invented. And also speech when and in my case, this is true, it doesn't provide the supporting income for the speakers. So it seems more gratuitous. It seems like it's driven by the person's ego's desire to be right, and not simply go along with the group, the welfare other people in a group and join up and take sides with them against oppression or something, but to actually be right at an individual level. That's kind of sometimes is a stretch for some people. And then the idea of comparing the social justice limitations. You can have a social credit system, which we don't really have formally, but which the tech companies are sort of employing against us sometimes. But there have been problems like, for example, if you wanted to have a job in academia, you had, as Colin Wright talked about, and on his Reality's Last Stand, he talked about, and he said that to have a job in academia, you have to show that you've actually assisted people of specific minority groups. It isn't just enough to help people. You have to help people in marginalized groups. And so when you evaluate a person's ability to give back to the community in terms of what group they belong to, and in terms of systemic oppression and demanding allyship, demanding anti-racism as a condition for them to be able to speak, that they have to do to prove they can be anti-racist first, so that they can raise money for other people's causes before they can speak for their own. If you do something like that, that would be a use of reparation in the terminology. And then the last thing I kind of want to talk about, and this, we'll get on to this in the next video, the lone wolf affiliation problem, which I sort of have when I affiliate upwardly, which is a term that George Gilder used, upward affiliation, a lot in his Men and Marriage book. When you want to be with people, and even in erotic situations, whom you consider superior, and it actually means in my case it was actually identifying with masculinity, not with so actually that's a very cis thing to do, and sort of resent the idea of others whom you seem as weaker, expect you to give attention to them, and you feel like it's beneath you, or you feel like it's beneath you to join in with them in a protest, that it's wrong for you to have to be on the streets yourself and join in a strike or something, anti-solidarity. Now, if too many people do this, it scales and it invites, it can invite authoritarianism, particularly on the fascism side. And back in the 80s, people were a lot looser when they would talk about others. They would say that's the best he can do, when talking about whom someone had as a date, or usually in the heterosexual world, got married to. Now that seems very destructive to talk that way. We sort of need to have a word for that. So I kind of called that the mousetrap problem, maybe after Agatha Christie's play or something. But anyway, that's kind of what I had today. And we'll follow this up by tracing how this applied to me in my own life in another video. And I do thank you for listening.